The night they arrived, the mountains were already swallowing the last slivers of light. The air was cold, crisp, and the trees, tall, dark, and watching, seemed to breathe in time with the wind. There was something about them that didn't feel right, something just off, like the earth had been holding its breath for too long. But none of them noticed, at least not yet. Perfect, Jake grinned, his voice thick with the promise of adventure. He slammed the car door behind him and tossed the keys into his pocket. No cell service, no distractions, just us. The cabin they'd rented was the kind that you only saw in those dreamy Instagram photos, the kind with huge windows, a stone fireplace, and a perfect view of snow-capped peaks. It was isolated, far from the nearest town, nestled at the base of a range that looked so ancient and rugged. It felt as though it had been there since the beginning of time. They'd come for a weekend to escape, to recharge, to forget. "Let's get the fire going," Emily suggested. "It's freezing out here." They made their way inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloping them. The space was airy but rustic, furnished with dark wood and soft rugs, the kind of place you could lose yourself in for days. But the moment Matt stepped into the living room, a strange unease crawled over him, settling deep into his chest. He brushed it off. He'd never been the superstitious type, but as his eyes lingered on the windows, he could swear the shadows outside had thickened, as if the trees themselves were pressing in closer. "You okay?" Emily asked, noticing his hesitation. "Yeah, just tired. Long drive," he lied. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling. "Let's eat," Jake declared, already pulling out bottles of wine. "We'll worry about the weirdness tomorrow." They cracked open drinks, laughing and dancing around the fire, making the usual jokes about their college days. For a while, everything was normal. The shadows outside stayed still. The crackle of the fire filled the room, and the mountains, well, they seemed distant again. But something about the place felt heavy, like it was absorbing their energy, drawing them in. It was nearly midnight when Jake decided to step outside for a moment. He opened the door, letting the cold air rush in, and stared into the darkness. The moon was barely visible, tucked behind a heavy layer of clouds, but in the dim light, the forest seemed to pulse. For a moment, he thought he saw something move between the trees. A shadow, tall and thin, weaving in and out of the trunks. He squinted, but whatever it was, it vanished before his eyes. "Dude, you're freaking out," Matt said, coming up behind him. "It's just the wind or something." "Yeah, probably," Jake said, shaking his head. He stepped back inside, but the thought of that shadow lingered. Inside, Sarah was already curled up on one of the couches, flipping through her phone. She glanced up when they walked in. "What's up?" "I don't know. It's too quiet out there," Jake said, "like something's waiting." Emily stood from where she had been sitting, glancing out the windows. "It's just a little creepy, right? I mean, look at those trees. They're so tall. I can barely see the tops. The whole place is creepy," Matt muttered under his breath. "Let's have another drink and call it a night," Sarah said. No need to get worked up over nothing. But they did get worked up. Not right away, but slowly. The night stretched on, but the unease never quite left. Even when they finally made their way to bed, the stillness outside pressed against the windows. Too thick, too unnatural. The next morning, the sun barely broke through the clouds. The air was still, cold, with a faint scent of pine and earth. When they gathered around the kitchen, there was a heaviness to the silence, like something unspoken hung between them. Matt sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He hadn't slept much. It was like his dreams had been filled with odd, half-formed images, faces that weren't faces, trees that bent impossibly low, and shadows that swayed like smoke. When he had woken up, his head had been spinning, his mind unable to make sense of what he had seen. "So anyone want to do something today?" Jake asked, trying to break the tension. Emily nodded. "I say we go for a hike. It's beautiful out there." "I don't know," Matt said, his voice hoarse. I'm not really feeling up for it. You're just tired from the drive, Sarah said. Come on, we can all use some fresh air. But the second they stepped outside, everything felt wrong again. The landscape stretched out before them like a postcard, beautiful but unnerving in its vastness. The trees around them whispered in the wind, but it wasn't the normal rustling sound they were used to. It was different, distant, and the forest seemed so quiet, too quiet. Emily had the first real moment of discomfort. As they walked deeper into the woods, her footsteps grew slower, her breath more erratic. Did anyone hear that? She asked, looking over her shoulder, but the others were ahead of her, laughing, distracted by the beauty of the landscape. No, Jake said, frowning. What do you mean? It's just, I keep hearing something behind me, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, like footsteps. But when I turn around, there's nothing. It's probably just the wind, Sarah said, though there was a touch of uncertainty in her voice. But Emily wasn't convinced. The further they hiked, the stranger it felt. The trees seemed to loom closer, casting longer shadows that didn't quite match up with the light. It was as though the entire forest was shifting in ways it shouldn't, subtly bending and twisting when they weren't looking. And every time Emily looked over her shoulder, she could have sworn she saw figures, faint, blurred shapes that moved between the trunks. But the others weren't seeing it. Jake seemed unaffected, pointing out cool rock formations, and Matt, despite his unease, still forced a smile when Emily asked if he was okay. The illusion only deepened as the day wore on. By afternoon, the air had grown thick, and the trees were bending in ways that made no sense. The wind had picked up too, unnaturally so, curling through the forest like something alive. I think we should head back, Emily said, her voice sharp with urgency. This place is wrong. Wrong? Jake scoffed. It's just a forest. But it wasn't just a forest. The longer they stayed out there, the more they realized that the landscape wasn't like anything they had seen before. The trees seemed to bend toward them, reaching out with long, crooked limbs. The ground beneath their feet felt spongy and soft, like it was breathing, and the air felt like it was pressing in from all sides. When they finally turned back toward the cabin, they found their way blocked. The path, the one they had walked down not long before, had disappeared. In its place was an impenetrable wall of thick, knotted trees, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. What the hell? Matt muttered. That's not possible, Sarah said, stepping forward and pushing at the bark of one of the trees. But it didn't move. It was solid, immovable. Jake started to laugh. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. This is just some weird trail, like a loop or something. But no one was laughing now, as the group stood there, staring at the impossible wall of trees that now separated them from the path. They had just walked. Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. The forest had shifted. She was certain of it. The once distant, towering trees that lined their path had closed in on them, their trunks twisting and curling into grotesque shapes. The air felt thick, suffocating, like something unseen was pressing against her chest, urging her to breathe faster. Okay, this isn't funny anymore, Matt said, his voice shaky, a crack of panic seeping in. He backed away from the twisted wall of bark. How the hell did this happen? Jake ran his hand through his hair and tried to shake off the unease that had started to build. It's just a damn loop. We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. He didn't sound convincing, even to himself. His eyes flicked nervously over his shoulder as if he expected something to emerge from the trees. I'm telling you, Emily said, her voice trembling now. It wasn't like this when we came through. This wasn't here. The trees weren't like this. They all turned to look at the trees once more, their gnarled branches twisting upward in unnatural spirals, forming a jagged web of wood and shadow. The trunks weren't just intertwined now. They were bound, as if something was holding them together. Emily could have sworn they were moving, slowly but deliberately, like the fingers of a hand curling in on itself. A sickening sense of vertigo overtook her, and her stomach churned. It was as though the forest wasn't just alive. It was aware of them, watching them. Jake took a step toward the entangled mass of trees, his bravado starting to waver. "All right, I'll go through. It's just some weird forest trick. We'll find the path, I swear." "Jake, wait," Emily said, her heart pounding. "Don't." But it was too late. He was already pushing past the first layer of twisted wood. At first it seemed like nothing happened. Jake disappeared behind the trees, his movements steady and resolute. But then there was a sudden crack of splintering wood, followed by a strained, panicked shout from Jake. "Jake?" Matt called, rushing forward. "What the hell's going on? Jake?" There was no answer, just the crackling of branches. Without thinking, Emily ran toward the wall of trees. Her feet felt like they were dragging through molasses, the air heavier with each step. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the bark, expecting to feel the rough texture. But instead, the tree shifted, pulling away from her touch as if it had a life of its own. "Emily, don't." Matt's voice was a panicked whisper behind her, but she didn't care anymore. There was someone, out there in the forest, something she had to find. Jake was in trouble, and they couldn't just leave him behind. She pushed through the trees one by one, as the forest seemed to bend around her. Her breathing quickened as she moved, feeling the weight of the forest grow heavier with every step. And then, just as she thought she might collapse under the pressure of it all, she broke through. The forest opened up into a small clearing, and there, standing in the center, was Jake. But he wasn't moving. His eyes were wide, glazed over, his body as still as the trees around him. But the most disturbing part wasn't Jake. It was what was standing behind him. The creature was tall, unnaturally so. It stood nearly twice the height of a normal man, its body thin, almost skeletal. Its form was made of wood, bark, and branches, twisted and knotted together, yet fluid in its movements. The creature's limbs were long, spindly, like the branches of the trees themselves, but the joints cracked and bent in ways that should not have been possible. Its face was a smooth, hollow surface of bark, with no eyes, no features, just a blank, unsettling mask, and it was staring directly at her. "Emily." Jake's voice was hoarse, a whisper from his lips. His eyes fluttered, but he didn't seem to have the strength to move. He was distant, as though he were no longer fully aware of the world around him. The creature stepped forward, its limbs creaking with every movement, its body contorting as it reached for Jake. Its long fingers curled around his arm, pulling him toward it. "Jake!" Emily screamed, but her voice felt wrong, as if the forest itself were swallowing her words. She felt frozen in place, rooted to the ground, like a sapling trapped in a storm. The creature's head tilted toward her, and then it moved, too quickly. Its long fingers stretched, reaching for Emily, its body bending in ways that defied logic. Behind her, Matt emerged from the trees, his face pale, his breath ragged. "Emily, what's happening? What is that thing?" But Emily couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. She was caught, paralyzed by the thing's gaze. And then, as though something inside her snapped, she heard it. The voice was soft, almost like a whisper in the back of her mind. But it was clear, like it had always been there. It spoke with an authority that shook her to the core. "You were chosen," it said, and she felt it, deep within her bones. "This place has been waiting for you." Matt was pulling at her now, but his hand felt distant, like he was no longer part of the same world. His voice echoed through the fog of Emily's mind, but the creature's presence was all-consuming. "We all are," the voice continued, "bound to the trees, to the land, to the breath of the mountains." The world tilted, spinning out of control as Emily's vision blurred. She looked back at Jake, his face vacant, his body slack in the creature's grasp. Then slowly, ever so slowly, the realization dawned. The creatures, they weren't just living in the forest. They were the forest. The twisting gnarled trees, the shadows that followed them, the whispers that had taunted the edges of their minds. The forest had been watching them, waiting for them, and now it had claimed them. The tall creature's bark face shifted, cracking open in jagged lines, and Emily understood. It had been speaking to them all along. Through the creaking trees, the rustling branches, the isolation of the cabin wasn't a vacation getaway. It was a trap. The final moment hit her all at once. The entangled trees weren't a barrier. They were the forest's will. The mountain was the living heart of this place, and it didn't want them to leave. The trees were its body, the creatures its limbs. They had been walking in its veins all along. As the creature's form grew closer, reaching toward her, Emily saw something that made her blood run cold. Behind the creature, there was another one, taller, even more twisted, its form indistinct, its eyes hollow. The taller one whispered weakly, and this time it was her own voice saying, "This is where we belong."